Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how to periodize our training by breaking up a long-term plan into phases. Before planning any training, the first thing that needs to be considered is competition. This will guide the entire training plan because this determines when performance needs to be at its peak. For example, if an athlete's primary competition lies somewhere in October, that's when the athlete will aim to be performing at their best. This is a more straightforward process for athletes involved in an individual sport, such as sprinting, track cycling, swimming, or weightlifting, since the competition will be performed on one day or over a few days. So there is a very distinct time point that the athlete needs to be at their best. However, when we have a look at team sports, there is usually an entire season that the athletes need to be performing well for. This season could last months, and in some cases, could last the majority of the year. So the athletes need to be in good condition for long periods of time. Later in this video, we will explore how to plan training for both team sports and individual sports, but first, let's have a look at how training can be broken up into phases. We have three general phases of training that can be applied to any sport or discipline. These three phases are simply different methods of applying progressive overload to achieve a desired outcome. The phases are the accumulation phase, the intensification phase, and the realization phase. Although these are fancy names, the meaning behind them is fairly straightforward. The accumulation phase is when training volume is increased over time while intensity remains the same, or could increase very slightly. This model of progressive overload is best to build the foundation of the athlete. The adaptations emphasized from an accumulation phase of training will include the following. Structural adaptations. So this will be best for stimulating muscle hypertrophy and building connective tissue resilience. Increasing work capacity. This means that our ability to handle and recover from greater amounts of high intensity training will be increased. And an accumulation phase of training will also not load the joints as heavily as high intensity training will. So if we are always performing the same exercises with very high intensities, our joints will likely become irritated or injured over time. An accumulation phase will both provide a variation in loading and also build the connective tissue resilience as mentioned previously. However, the downside to the accumulation phase of training is that performance will simply not be at its best. This is because we are implementing non-specific training methods and fatigue accumulation will be high from the increases in volume. Moving on to the intensification phase, this is essentially the opposite to the accumulation. Here, we have intensity being increased as a form of progressive overload, and volume remains stationary or maybe increases slightly. This model of progression is best for creating specific adaptations that transfer well to the sport. This will emphasize the qualities of neural adaptations, so the motor patterns of high intensity training will be trained in this phase and movements will become more efficient, and increasing specific performance. So qualities which transfer well to the sport that is being trained for can be emphasized during the intensification phase. However, once again, there are trade-offs with this type of training. While sport performance may improve during this phase, other qualities won't be trained. The amount of training that can be performed won't be as high since a large work capacity hasn't been built, and the athletes are at a higher risk of joint injury if this phase is performed for too long. The last phase is the realization phase. This is where intensity will increase while volume will decrease simultaneously. This should only ever account for a small portion of the entire training year, at a time where the athlete is required to perform at their absolute best. The realization phase will emphasize the following qualities. Fatigue reduction. Because volume is decreasing, the athlete will reduce accumulated fatigue and be in a fresh state, and revealing the athlete's full potential. Since fatigue is being reduced and specific intensity is increasing, the athlete can perform at their absolute best. This is because fatigue will mask absolute fitness and decrease performance. The downside to the realization phase is that we are not actually creating adaptations. We are more so just realizing our built-up potential. So if this type of training is performed for too long, we will actually detrain and become worse. Now that we've discussed the various phases of training, the question becomes, how do we structure the plan in a sequence to achieve peak performance? Let's now apply these principles separately to both an individual sport and a team sport. As mentioned previously, competition will guide the planning of training. So the first thing to do is to input the competition dates. Let's theoretically suggest that there is one primary competition toward the end of the year that the athlete needs to be at their absolute best for, and another competition that the athlete needs to be in good but not absolute peak condition. For example, this might be a state championship and a national championship, or a national championship and an international competition, depending on the level of the athlete. The athlete may also have various other minor competitions leading into these primary events, but these are not important, and the athlete doesn't need to be in peak condition for them. So this athlete would likely want to have two primary times to peak. Since the latter competition is more important than the former, it will have a greater peak in order for the athlete to perform at full potential. Therefore, applying the phases of periodization for this athlete may look something like this. We start with an extended accumulation phase in order to build a large work capacity and receive structural adaptations. This will set the athlete up for success later on in the year. Next, we may transition into an intensification phase to work on more specific qualities that will transfer to sporting performance. And as the athlete is approaching their first key competition, they may implement a short realization phase to reduce fatigue and capitalize on the potential they have built up in the previous two phases. After a short transition phase, where the athlete has no planned training, the athlete may then begin the preparation for the next major competition by implementing another accumulation phase. This accumulation phase may be shorter since there will be more emphasis on peaking in the latter half of the year. Once again, an intensification period will follow, and finally a peaking phase will allow the athlete to be at peak performance when it counts. The peaking phase at this time of the year may be longer than the previous, since absolute peak performance is the goal for this competition. The athlete may then take an extended transitional phase to recover physically and mentally from the year of training. Moving on now to periodizing the year for a team sport athlete. Let's first establish when the matches are throughout the year to guide our application of phases. Here, we have an entire season of competitive matches with darker boxes indicating more important games and lighter boxes indicating less important games. Since the season lasts for an extended period of time, we can't select distinct time points to peak for. If we try to be in peak condition for the entire season, volume will be too low and we will actually detrain. So we may try to be in our best condition towards the end of the year when matches may be more important, but still be in good condition for the entire season. So starting with the end of the previous season, we have a transitional phase as a recovery period for the athletes. We then may implement a long accumulation phase to build work capacity and provide structural adaptations. As we transition into the season, we may then move into an intensification period as some important matches are approaching and performance needs to be reasonably high. After this group of matches, we don't have many very important competitions until the end of the season. So another short accumulation phase may be implemented to ensure work capacity and tissue tolerance don't drop too low. Now, moving into the latter half of the season, we may start to get into peak condition by transitioning into an intensification phase. This will then lead into the realization phase for physical condition to be at its highest. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.